We have a shocking development tonight, and I want to be very clear about what you're about to hear. This is a dramatized, hypothetical case file, built to show how these systems can fail. But the mechanisms in it are real. The methods are real. And what this reveals changes everything about how money can move when everyone is supposedly watching. Because in the file I'm holding, there are official records. There are sealed records. And there is testimony under oath. And the story they tell is as simple as it is disturbing. Before we go further, subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear is not being explained clearly anywhere else, and once you understand the pattern, you'll never look at compliance the same way again. Alright, let's start with what the file calls the pivot. The central institution in this hypothetical case is a major global bank I'm going to refer to as Northbridge Private. Not because that's a real entity, but because this scenario is meant to mirror how a large, cross-border private bank operates when reputational risk collides with revenue. And the client at the center of the movement is a person I'll call Marina Vale. According to the case file, Vale was a long-time financial operator for a now-arrested financier named Rowan Slate. Slate's arrest is the moment the public thinks the story ends. In the file, that's where it begins. Let me read this word for word. This is from an internal correspondence log marked released as evidence, dated July 11, 2019, 8:42 a.m., subject line, Slate arrest, immediate client exposure review. Quote, we should assume heightened media and regulatory attention. Do not initiate new account openings connected to Slate's sphere. Maintain existing relationships per guidance until further instruction. Read that again. Maintain existing relationships. Not close them. Not freeze them. Maintain them. Now, that alone could be corporate caution. A bank doesn't want to trigger a run. A bank doesn't want to create a headline. But the next document is where it stops being caution and starts looking like choreography. The file includes a set of payment messages, international wires, summarized in what's described as official records from the bank's own transaction monitoring export. They're timestamped over a 17-day window after Slate's arrest. The amounts are precise. The dates are precise. The routing is precise. On July 15, 2019, at 2:17 p.m., a transfer of $4,950,000 moved from a Northbridge custody account labeled MV Holdings, portfolio cash to an entity in the Caribbean, listed as Larkstone Trustees Limited. The narrative field reads, Investment Rebalancing. On July 18, 2019, $1,800,000 moved to a Zurich-based fiduciary labeled Astor & Company. Services, narrative, professional fees. On July 22, 2019, $3,200,000 moved to a London account held under the name Whitehaven Property Management, narrative, asset maintenance. And on July 28, 2019, this is the one highlighted in yellow in the file, another $6,750,000 moved, this time split into 3 tranches within 7 minutes, each just under an internal threshold that would typically auto-escalate for manual review. Not once. Not twice. Repeatedly. And the case file doesn't just show the transfers. It shows the discussion around them. There's an email chain, internal correspondence, between a relationship manager, a compliance officer, and someone whose name is redacted, just a black bar with the initials SR. The relationship manager writes, Client requests expedited processing. Client notes heightened privacy concerns due to media. Compliance responds, source of funds previously documented as legacy wealth. However, adverse media risk now extreme. Recommend hold pending EDD. Ed. Enhance due diligence. The thing you do when the world is screaming at you to look closer. And then, the redacted executive, SR, replies with a single line, process. We are not the police. Let me read that again. Process. We are not the police. Now, if you've ever worked around regulated finance, you know that sentence is a tell. It's a tell because it's technically true and practically irrelevant. Banks aren't the police. But banks have obligations. And when they say we are not the police, what they often mean is, we don't want to see what this might be. But it gets worse. Because this file includes what appears to be a contemporaneous notes entry, a typed meeting record, dated July 24, 2019, titled, Reputation Containment, Slate Sphere. It lists attendees by first name and initial only. Some are redacted. And it includes a section labeled Exposure Minimization. Quote, recommend shifting client liquidity away from visible corridors. Avoid U.S. correspondent where possible. Prefer internal netting and non-U.S. rails. Avoid U.S. correspondent. Prefer non-U.S. rails. That's not a client asking for privacy. That's an institution talking about routing strategy. Here's the part no one expected. The file includes a document described as a Draft Suspicious Activity Report, or SAR, again, in this hypothetical scenario, created in the bank system but never filed. It's stamped draft, do not submit, and the reason field reads, pending legal review. The narrative says, client linked to arrested financier. Rapid movement of funds. Possible attempt to conceal beneficial ownership. Pattern consistent with asset shielding. And then, there's a comment thread attached to the draft. One comment says, if filed, triggers mandatory offboarding timeline. Another says, client threatens litigation. Relationship profitability high. And then, a final comment, hold. Await external guidance. External guidance from who? That question matters because the case file includes a letter on what's labeled DOJ letterhead in the training materials. Again, dramatized, hypothetical, dated August 2nd, 2019. It's a request for preservation of records. It instructs the bank to retain communications, KYC files, and transaction logs connected to a defined set of names. Most of those names are redacted in the copy inside the file. But one line is visible. It reads, include any accounts where Marina Vale is signatory, beneficiary, or acting on instruction. And in the margin, someone has handwritten too late. Too late. Now, I want you to picture what that means. A bank receives notice. Preserve everything. This is under scrutiny. And inside the bank, someone is already asking whether the funds are gone. The file then moves into what it calls Photo Archive Reveal, and I have to describe what's shown. There are screen captures from a lobby camera inside a private banking office. The faces of two individuals are blurred, and the file explicitly says, mention redactions and missing faces. But the timestamps are visible. July 16, 2019, 9:03 a.m. A woman in a dark blazer enters with a folder. July 16, 9:26 a.m. The same woman exits holding nothing. July 16, 9:29 a.m. A man in a suit enters carrying a laptop case. July 16, 10:11 a.m. He exits, speaking into a phone. The file includes a caption, same-day transfer authorization meeting. And if you think that's speculative, wait. Because there's also testimony. A section labeled Courtroom Moments includes an excerpt from a deposition transcript. It's marked under oath. The witness is a former transaction monitoring analyst, identified only as Witness 3 in the training file. The question, did you raise concerns about Marina Vale's post-arrest transfers? Answer, yes. Question, how many times? Answer, at least 4. Question, what happened each time? Answer, the alerts were closed with a senior override. Question, senior override by whom? Answer, by the private bank head's office. Names were not disclosed to me. It came back as resolved per management. Resolved per management, official records. Under oath. Released as evidence. Internal correspondence. Contemporaneous notes. All the credibility signals are there, because in any real investigation, the pattern isn't one memo. It's a system. And then the file introduces a second layer, the structuring. If you're not familiar with that term, It's when transactions are deliberately sized or broken up to avoid automated thresholds and reporting triggers. The file provides exact numbers. It shows a series of outgoing payments between August 5th and August 19th, 2019, each ranging from $92,000 to $98,500, all labeled consulting, all going to different recipients, and then, this is key, most of those recipients route the money back to two aggregation points, one in Luxembourg, one in Singapore. The file labels them aggregation node A and aggregation node B. It's not one big wire. It's dozens of small ones. It's not a flood. It's a drip. A drip that becomes a river. Not once. Not twice. Repeatedly. Now, the bank's defense in the file is predictable. There's a memo from Legal and Risk, dated August 21st, 2019, that reads, "No conviction. No direct charge against client. Adverse media alone insufficient to terminate. Maintain service with risk mitigations." That sentence is how the world stays clean on paper while staying dirty in practice. Because the next record is what the file calls risk mitigations. It's a KYC refresh form. A standard re-verification. It's supposed to ask, what's your source of wealth? What's your purpose? What's your beneficial ownership structure? In the copy provided, half of it is redacted. Names are blacked out. Addresses are missing. One signature box is empty. And yet, the status at the top is stamped, approved. Here's the part no one expected. There's a line on the KYC form under Source of Wealth Narrative. It says, Legacy Family Assets, no change. And then, in tiny typed font at the bottom of the page, narrative provided by RM. RM means Relationship Manager. In other words, the bank is letting its own salesperson write the story that justifies continuing the relationship. Let me read this word for word from the internal chat log that follows. Relationship Manager. Client wants certainty. Wants guarantee no account interruption. Compliance. We cannot guarantee. Relationship Manager. Then we will lose client. Compliance. Risk elevated. Relationship Manager. We are a private bank. And then, a final message from a senior account executive. Do what you need to do. Keep it quiet. Keep it quiet. Now look at the timeline. Slate is arrested. The bank tells staff to maintain existing relationships. The client moves millions fast. Alerts are overridden. A draft SAR is written and shelved. Routing strategy is discussed to avoid U.S. corridors. KYC is approved even with redactions and missing data. And internally, the instruction is keep it quiet. You have to ask why. Because if this were anyone else, the outcome would be immediate. The account would be restricted. The relationship would be terminated. The bank would overcomply out of fear. But in this file, fear doesn't win. Profit does. And that brings us to the meaning. This isn't about one document. It's about behavior. It's about the quiet choices that happen after the headlines fade, when cameras leave the courthouse steps, when the public assumes accountability has already occurred. That's when the real work begins, moving assets, repapering ownership, creating distance, building buffers. And the bank, in this scenario, doesn't need to commit a dramatic act. It just needs to be passive in exactly the right way. Passive approvals. Closed alerts. Delayed filings. Vague narratives. Redacted names. Missing faces. And when the system is built to treat adverse media as optional, optional becomes a loophole. A loophole becomes a corridor. And corridors become escape routes. If this were anyone else, you wouldn't get a senior override 4 times. If this were anyone else process, we are not the police wouldn't be an acceptable answer. If this were anyone else, pending legal review wouldn't mean never submit. But it happened here because the incentives are aligned. A private bank earns on custody. It earns on advisory. It earns on transactions. And if you can keep the relationship alive long enough to move what needs moving, the bank keeps the revenue and reduces the visible exposure. And the moral stakes are not abstract. Because in cases like this, again, In this hypothetical scenario, money isn't just money. Money is power. Money is silence. Money is the ability to hire, to intimidate, to drag things out, to wait people out. And that's why official records matter. That's why under oath matters. That's why released as evidence matters. Because without paper, there is no accountability. Without timelines, there is no pattern. Without patterns, there is no consequence. I'm not making accusations. I'm reading what's in the file. And what's in the file is a system that knows how to survive scrutiny by appearing compliant while behaving conveniently. So here's where we land. In this dramatized case file, the revelations are clear. After a notorious arrest, an associate's funds didn't freeze. They moved. They moved quickly. They moved strategically. And the bank's internal machinery, its transaction monitoring, its compliance escalations, its due diligence, didn't stop it. It managed it. Not once. Not twice. Repeatedly. The long-term implication is the part that should bother you the most. Because if a system can maintain existing relationships at the exact moment it should be most cautious, then the rules are not rules. They're suggestions. And suggestions don't protect the public. Suggestions protect the institution. And if you're wondering what changes, it's this. You stop believing that accountability is automatic. You stop assuming that an arrest ends the financial story. You start watching what happens in the quiet weeks after, when money moves and paperwork gets stamped approved. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, share this, and stay alert. Don't let anyone tell you this doesn't matter, because it does.